In the hushed, smoke-filled map room of the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff in Tokyo, late in 1943, the prevailing mood was not one of panic, but of a cold, geometric confidence rooted in the unchangeable laws of physics and geography, specifically the terrifying vastness of the Pacific Ocean, which Admiral Maneichi Koga, successor to the legendary Yamamoto, viewed not as a battlefield, but as Japan's greatest ally. As Koga stood before the massive Mercator projection that dominated the wall, tracing the invisible lines of latitude that separated the American anchorage at Pearl Harbor from the inner defense perimeter of the empire, he relied on a strategic doctrine known as Zengen Sakusen, attrition operations, which was predicated on a single fatal assumption regarding the logistical tether of the United States Navy. The logic was mathematically seductive. The distance from Hawaii to the Marshall Islands was over 2,000 miles, and to the Caroline Islands was nearly 3,000, a staggering expanse of blue desert that imposed a hard limit on naval operations known as the radius of action, meaning that any American task force attempting to strike deep into Japanese territory would burn half its fuel just to get to the fight, leaving only a sliver of endurance for combat before being forced to turn around and limp back to the safety of Pearl Harbor to drink from the oil tanks. To the Japanese admirals, the American fleet was a powerful but short-winded giant, a boxer that could throw a devastating punch but had to retreat to its corner after every round, creating a rhythmic yo-yo effect where the U.S. Navy would strike, deplete its resources, and then vanish from the theater for weeks or even months to refuel and rearm. This cyclical vulnerability was the cornerstone of Japanese defense, for it guaranteed them precious intervals of silence, weeks of calm seas during which they could repair their airfields, reinforce their island garrisons, and reposition their own combined fleet to prepare for the decisive battle, Kantai Kessen, on their own terms, close to their own supply lines, while the Americans were stretched to the breaking point. This belief was not born of arrogance, but of observation, for in the early years of the war, the tyranny of distance had indeed strangled American ambitions, a reality experienced viscerally thousands of miles away on the heaving bridge of a Fletcher-class destroyer escorting a carrier task force near the Gilbert Islands. Lieutenant Commander Miller, clutching the stanchion of the USS Nicholas as the ship rolled 20 degrees in the heavy swell, watched his fuel gauges with the same anxiety a man watches a ticking bomb, because in 1943, a destroyer was a thoroughbred racehorse with a gluttonous appetite, burning through thousands of gallons of Bunker C fuel oil every day just to maintain station. Miller knew the unforgiving arithmetic of steam propulsion. At high speeds during combat maneuvering, his turbines guzzled oil at a rate that could drain his tanks in 48 hours, and once he hit the point of no return, he became a liability to the entire fleet, a dead weight that had to be towed or abandoned. The standard operating procedure of the era dictated that to refuel, the entire task force had to retire to a forward base or rendezvous with a slow, vulnerable tanker in calm waters, a maneuver that was fraught with danger and required the cessation of offensive operations. Miller had seen operations canceled simply because the legs of the escort ships were too short, forcing the carriers to turn back just when the enemy was vulnerable, a humiliating retreat dictated by the emptiness of the fuel bunkers. The ocean was simply too big, and the ships were too thirsty. The Japanese strategy relied on the Americans seizing an island, spending months building port facilities and tank farms, and then using that island as a stepping stone to the next, a plodding, methodical advance that would take decades to reach Tokyo. Koga and his staff laughed at the idea of a blitzkrieg across the Pacific because they knew that a fleet without a base was a fleet that was dying. Ships needed fresh water for their boilers, provisions for their crews, and thousands of tons of ordnance, and these things did not exist in the open ocean. The Japanese commanders felt secure in the knowledge that the Americans were tethered to their harbors by an invisible steel chain of logistics, a chain that snapped tight every time they ventured too far west. They could not imagine that the Americans were about to break the laws of naval warfare by deciding that if they couldn't bring the fleet to the base, they would bring the base to the fleet. As Miller watched the horizon, hungry for a fight but bound by his fuel gauge, he represented the frustration of a navy that had the power to win but lacked the reach to finish the job, trapped in a strategic stalemate
where the sheer size of the Earth seemed to be on the side of the empire. The Japanese were banking their survival on the belief that the Americans would have to go home to sleep. They were unprepared for the terrifying possibility that the enemy might decide to never go home at all. The man charged with breaking this iron law of distance was not a dashing aviator or a battleship tactician, but a 60-year-old logistical savant named Commodore Worrell Reed Carter, a recalled retiree who possessed a mind that functioned like a master inventory ledger and who understood that in modern warfare, a shell that cannot be delivered to the gun breech is as useless as a stone. Under the directive of Admiral Nimitz, Carter was given command of Service Squadron 10, or Servron 10, a unit that was destined to become the most bizarre and structurally complex armada in naval history, essentially a floating industrial metropolis designed to weigh anchor and follow the combat fleet wherever it went. In early 1944, the test of this revolutionary concept took place in the placid, turquoise waters of Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a location that possessed a magnificent deep-water lagoon, but absolutely nothing else. No piers, no cranes, no fuel tanks, and no warehouses. Yet when the exhausted Task Force 58 arrived after their strikes, they did not find a barren wilderness, but a bustling city that had materialized out of thin air. Carter had assembled a fleet of hundreds of auxiliary vessels that acted as a surrogate harbor, creating a floating infrastructure where specialized ships performed the functions of terrestrial buildings. There were concrete barges dedicated solely to baking bread, reefer ships that acted as floating freezers holding tons of Australian beef and fresh eggs, floating dry docks capable of lifting destroyers out of the water, and massive distillery ships that sucked in the ocean and spit out fresh water for boilers and canteens. But the beating heart of this floating city was the mastery of underway replenishment, UNREP, a technique that the U.S. Navy transformed from a dangerous experiment into a high-speed industrial ballet. We zoom in on the deck of the fleet oiler USS Cimarron, steaming at 12 knots through the swells, parallel to an Essex-class carrier, separated by only 80 feet of rushing water that created a terrifying hydrodynamic suction effect known as the Venturi interaction, which constantly threatened to pull the two massive hulls together in a catastrophic collision. On the deck of the oiler, the boatsmen's mates, stripped to the waist and slick with salt spray, operated the new span wire rigs, shooting a shot line across to the carrier to haul over the heavy rubber hoses, keeping the tension constant with winches that compensated for the rolling of the ships. This was not just refueling, it was a high-wire act of physics where millions of gallons of bunker C fuel oil and high-octane avgas were pumped across the gap while both ships were moving, a feat the Japanese Navy considered too dangerous to attempt in rough seas, but which the Americans performed as a daily chore, rain or shine. Simultaneously, on the other side of the carrier, an ammunition ship would be high-lining bombs and torpedoes using transfer chairs, swinging tons of ordnance across the gap, while sailors on the receiving end caught the crates with practiced ease. The scene at Majuro was a kaleidoscope of logistical violence, where the mall, the central anchorage, was crowded with water taxis ferrying replacement crews, mailbags, and even movies between ships, creating a level of comfort and efficiency that rivaled the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Carter's genius lay in the standardization of this chaos, creating a system where a battleship could enter the lagoon at dawn, pull alongside an oiler, take on 500,000 gallons of fuel, move to an ammo ship to replenish its 16-inch shells, stop by a provision ship to load crates of lettuce and ice cream mix, and be steaming back out to the open ocean by sunset, fully revitalized without ever dropping an anchor or touching land. The Japanese commanders, relying on their charts of distance and fuel consumption, were calculating that the American fleet was currently 2,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, undergoing a 2-week refit. In reality, the American fleet was sitting fat and happy in a lagoon only a few hundred miles from the Japanese perimeter, resting its crews and topping off its tanks from a supply chain that stretched unbroken back to California. Serv-Ron 10 had effectively erased the concept of a base as a fixed geographic point. The base was now wherever Commodore Carter decided to park his barges, and this mobility meant that the radius of action for the U.S. Navy was no longer a circle drawn from Hawaii, but a moving zone of dominance that could slide across the map at will. As the sun set over Majuro, turning the lagoon into a sheet of gold reflecting the silhouettes of hundreds of ships, the tyranny of distance that Admiral Koga relied upon was quietly strangled by a web of fuel hoses and cargo nets, proving that the most dangerous vessel in the U.S. Navy was not the aircraft carrier, but the humble fleet oiler that allowed the carrier to never go home.
The destruction of Truk Lagoon in February 1944, an event the Japanese officially designated as Hailstone, but which the survivors simply remembered as the apocalypse, was supposed to be the crescendo of a raid, a violent but temporary spasm of violence, after which the laws of naval gravity would assert themselves and pull the American fleet back to its distant center of gravity in Hawaii. Admiral Mainichi Koga, surveying the catastrophic damage from his headquarters where the Gibraltar of the Pacific had been turned into a graveyard of sinking merchantmen and broken aircraft, issued orders that were steeped in the traditional rhythm of the war, instructing his surviving engineering units to begin the slow work of repairing the cratered runways and salvaging the port facilities, operating under the unshakable conviction that he had purchased a reprieve of at least 3 weeks. The logic of the Imperial General Staff was sound by all pre-1944 standards. The American Task Force 58 had sorted with a finite amount of aviation gasoline and a finite number of heavy bombs, and having expended them in a 2-day orgy of destruction, they were now purely defensive shells that must inevitably retreat 2,000 miles east to the magazines of Pearl Harbor to reload, a round-trip voyage that would grant Japan a precious window of silence to regroup and reinforce the next line of defense in the Marianas. But as the smoke drifted over the ruined lagoon, the American fleet did not turn east toward the sanctuary of home. Instead, it turned into the wind and remained prowling on the very doorstep of the empire, initiating a maneuver that would shatter the Japanese strategic worldview, the transfer of heavy ordnance at sea. Deep in the Philippine Sea, the carrier USS Enterprise, her magazines depleted of 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs and torpedoes, pulled alongside the ammunition ship USS Mauna Loa AE-8, a floating bomb dump that was sitting low in the water, packed with thousands of tons of high explosives. In the choppy swells of the open ocean, the two ships commenced a terrifyingly delicate industrial waltz known as the Burton method, a procedure that terrified even the most seasoned boatswain's mates because it involved swinging pallets of live ordnance between two heaving steel hulls that were steaming at 12 knots, separated by only a narrow gorge of rushing whitewater. On the deck of the Mauna Loa, the winches screamed as crates of 5-inch anti-aircraft shells and massive aerial bombs were hoisted into the air, dangling precariously over the abyss on tensioned wire highlines, swinging wildly with the roll of the ship before being lowered onto the hangar deck of the Enterprise, where sweating ordnancemen caught them with grappling hooks and brute strength. This was a violation of every safety protocol written in peacetime, a desperate improvisation where a single slipped cable or a collision between the ships could result in a detonation that would vaporize both vessels and leave a hole in the ocean. Yet the transfer continued relentlessly for hours, defying the wind and the waves. Thousands of tons of death flowed from the logistical train to the combat ships, topping off the magazines that Koga believed were empty and refilling the avgas tanks that Japanese intelligence assumed were running on fumes. The result was a strategic shock that hit the Japanese commanders in the Marianas like a physical blow. Instead of a 3-week silence, the radar screens on Saipan and Guam lit up again only days after the truck raids, showing the impossible signature of a fully armed American armada approaching for another strike. The Japanese garrison commanders,
who had been radioing Tokyo that the Americans had surely withdrawn, stared at the incoming waves of Hellcats and Helldivers with a cognitive dissonance that bordered on madness, unable to comprehend how a fleet could regenerate its lethality without returning to port. The tether that had bound the U.S. Navy to Pearl Harbor, the need to return to a fixed base to rearm, had been severed, not by magic, but by the daring seamanship of the logistical crews who had learned to pass ammunition in a sea state 4. The psychological impact on the Japanese high command was devastating. Their entire defensive strategy of attrition and recovery collapsed because the recovery phase had been eliminated from the equation. The enemy was no longer a visitor who came and went. They were a permanent resident of the Japanese waters, a siege engine that never ran out of ammunition and never needed to sleep. Admiral Koga realized with a sinking heart that the Pacific Ocean had effectively shrunk. The thousands of miles of buffer zone that were supposed to protect the homeland had been rendered irrelevant because the Americans had brought their magazines with them. The fleet that refused to go home was a terrifying new reality, transforming the war from a series of duel-like raids into a relentless, suffocating pressure that would not lift until the keel of the U.S. Navy was grinding against the shores of Japan itself, proving that the greatest weapon in the American arsenal was not the bomb, but the ship that delivered the bomb to the carrier in the middle of the ocean.
By late 1944, the Ulithi Atoll had become the best-kept secret in the Pacific War, a crescent-shaped coral reef roughly 4,000 miles from San Francisco that enclosed a lagoon large enough to hold the combined navies of the world. But its most terrifying asset was not the rows of aircraft carriers or the clusters of battleships, but a peculiar, ungainly structure floating near the northern channel known as the USS ABSD, the Advanced Base Sectional Dock. To the Japanese reconnaissance pilots who dared to fly high over the atoll, it looked like a disjointed spine of gray steel, a series of rectangular boxes welded together in defiance of traditional naval architecture. But to Chief Petty Officer Miller, a master welder with the lungs of a pearl diver and the hands of a surgeon, the ABSD was the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal because it possessed the godlike ability to resurrect the dead. In November 1944, the light cruiser USS Reno CL-96 limped into the lagoon, her starboard side ripped open by a Japanese submarine torpedo, a catastrophic wound that exposed her innards to the sea and left her listing precariously. In any previous naval war in human history, the Reno would have been a tactical write-off, forced to undertake a perilous slow-motion voyage back to the dry docks of Pearl Harbor or Bremerton, Washington, a round trip that would remove her from the order of battle for at least 6 months, effectively handing the Japanese a victory by attrition. But at Ulithi, the rules of attrition had been suspended. Miller stood on the wing wall of the ABSD-1, a behemoth capable of lifting 90,000 tons, enough to hoist a battleship completely out of the water, and watched as the massive ballast tanks were flooded, sinking the dock floor beneath the surface with a roar of escaping air. The Reno was guided into the submerged cradle by tugboats, a delicate operation where thousands of tons of wounded steel had to be positioned with inch-perfect precision over the keel blocks. Once the cruiser was secured, the pumps roared to life, expelling millions of gallons of seawater, and slowly, impossibly, the ocean released its grip. The ABSD rose, lifting the 6,000-ton cruiser into the air until her dripping, barnacle-encrusted hull was high and dry, exposing the jagged, twisted metal of the torpedo impact to the tropical sun. This was the moment the impossible repair began. Miller and his team of shipfitters attacked the hull not with the leisurely pace of a stateside union yard, but with the frantic intensity of combat surgery. They worked in the sweltering heat of the day and under the glare of arc lights at night, cutting away the mangled steel that looked like shredded tin foil, the sparks from their cutting torches cascading down into the lagoon like golden rain.
They were fabricating a false bow and patching the hull plating, using steel sheets that had been shipped across the ocean for this exact purpose, welding with a speed that defied the technical manuals. Inside the ship, electricians rewired compartments, and machinists turned new parts on lathes installed in the dock's wing walls. There were no forms to fill out, no budget meetings, just the relentless drive to get the ship back to the line. Meanwhile, in the darkly lit offices of the Naval Intelligence Bureau in Tokyo, analysts were confidently marking the USS Reno off their lists, categorized as heavily damaged, out of action until summer 1945. They based their calculations on the immutable laws of distance and industrial capacity, assuming that a ship with a hole in its side was a ship that had to go home. They could not conceive of a floating dry dock that could be towed to the war zone, essentially bringing the shipyard to the shipwreck. They did not know that at Ulithi, the U.S. Navy was performing heavy industrial maintenance in the middle of a coral reef. 2 weeks later, the pumps on the ABSD were reversed, the dock sank, and the USS Reno floated free, scarred but watertight, her engines turning over with a defiant rumble. She didn't head east to California for a refit. She turned west, back toward the Philippines, her magazines reloaded and her fuel tanks topped off. When the Reno was spotted by a Japanese scout plane off the coast of Luzon only weeks after being destroyed, the report caused consternation and denial among the Japanese command staff, who began to suspect that the Americans possessed a ghost fleet or were simply replacing sunk ships with identical new ones at a rate that defied logic. They were witnessing the death of their strategic hope, for the fleet train had proven that American ships did not die. They simply took a brief pause in a floating hospital and returned to the fight, rendering the Japanese strategy of whittling down the U.S. Navy mathematically impossible. The ABSD had turned the ocean into a garage, and Chief Petty Officer Miller, wiping the soot from his eyes as he watched the cruiser depart, knew that he had done more damage to the Empire with his welding torch than he ever could have with a gun, for he had denied the enemy the one thing they needed most: time. By the summer of 1945, the contrast between the two navies had ceased to be a difference in degree and had become a difference in kind, a disparity best illustrated by the ghostly silence that hung over the Kure naval arsenal in Japan, compared to the industrial roar that defined the waters off Okinawa. In Kure, the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, sat rusting in the mud, their hulls painted with humiliating camouflage patterns of green and beige to resemble islands, not because they were afraid to fight, but because the Empire had literally run out of the liquid energy required to turn their propellers. Captain Nakamura, standing on the tilted deck of the battleship Haruna, watched as American carrier planes buzzed overhead with impunity, dropping bombs on his stationary vessel as if it were a training target, knowing that his ship was no longer a warship, but a floating anti-aircraft battery tethered to the shore by the absolute absence of fuel. The desperation was so total that the government had initiated the Pine Root Oil Project, mobilizing school children to dig up pine stumps in a pathetic attempt to distill aviation fuel from tree sap, a medieval solution to a modern logistical collapse that saw the mighty combined fleet reduced to burning wood byproducts while the Americans steamed just over the horizon. Conversely, only a few hundred miles to the south, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet was staging the greatest display of logistical dominance in the history of human conflict, a maneuver that defied every textbook on naval strategy written before 1941. The fleet did not return to Ulithi or Pearl Harbor to prepare for the final assault on Japan. Instead, the supply chain simply extended itself like a telescoping steel arm, forming a continuous bridge of ships that spanned 5,000 miles from San Francisco to the gun line. The statistic that broke the mind of the Japanese High Command was not the number of carriers, but the endurance of those carriers. Ships of Task Force 38 were staying at sea for 60, 70, 80 days at a stretch, a feat of operational sustainability that was physically impossible for any other nation. The ocean surface itself seemed to disappear under the sheer density of the fleet train, a nomadic city of oilers, ammunition ships, hospital ships, and escort carriers that brought the entire American economy to the combat zone. We witnessed this through the eyes of a captured Japanese pilot pulled from the water by a U.S. destroyer who stands on the fantail wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the horizon in a state of catatonic shock. He does not see a fleet in the traditional sense. He sees a conveyor belt of infinite capacity. He sees a destroyer pulling away from an oiler after topping off, only to be replaced instantly by a cruiser, while mail helicopters shuttle sacks of letters between ships, and replacement aircraft are craned from escort carriers to the flight decks of the fleet carriers to replace losses within hours of them occurring. The pilot turns to an American sailor and asks in broken English when the fleet will return to base for repairs, only to receive the chilling answer that they are not going back. The base has come to them. This was the endless horizon, the realization that the United States had solved the problem of war's friction. They had created a force that did not need to pause, did not need to rest, and did not need to retreat. The logistical noose had tightened to the point where the Americans were effectively operating a domestic ferry service in the enemy's home waters, delivering naphthalm and ice cream with equal regularity. The Japanese strategy of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, had relied on the enemy becoming exhausted and overextended, but the fleet train had rendered exhaustion obsolete. As the Haruna burned in Kure Harbor, a victim of its own immobility, the American fleet prowled the coast, a self-regenerating hydra that grew stronger the longer it stayed at sea. The war ended not with a dramatic clash of battleships, but with the quiet, crushing weight of a supply ledger that had no red ink, proving that while courage could win a battle, only a supply chain that could move a continent across an ocean could win the war. The final image is of the Third Fleet at anchor in Tokyo Bay for the surrender, a forest of steel masts stretching as far as the eye can see, a visual testament to the fact that the Japanese admirals had laughed at the short-range fleet, only to find that the Americans had brought the entire world with them, refusing to leave until the rising sun had set forever.